He's a vegetable. Just drug the soup and get the signature, my son-in-law whispered, staring right at my face. He thought I was the same deaf, helpless old man I'd been for 3 years. He didn't know I'd had a secret surgery 4 days ago. They were planning to steal my estate and throw me in a rotting nursing home on my 70th birthday. They thought they were whispering to a ghost in a wheelchair. They forgot they were confessing to a superior court judge who had just regained his hearing. And I was about to deliver a verdict they would never forget. Before the gavel comes down, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. I need the jury on my side for this one. It all started on a Tuesday, when the silence finally broke. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy. It possessed a physical weight, like a wet wool blanket wrapped tight around my skull, pressing against my temples, suffocating the world before it could reach me. For 3 years, that silence was my home. It was my cell. My name is Thomas Vance. For 30 years, I sat on the bench of the Superior Court. I was the arbiter of truth. I heard the trembling stammer of liars, the weeping of the repentant, and the sharp, decisive crack of the gavel that ended all arguments. I lived in a world of words, of spoken testimonies, of verbal nuance. I was a man who listened, who weighed the tone of a voice as heavily as the evidence on the table. Then came the rain, a slick highway on a Tuesday night, a commercial truck that lost traction and slid across the center line like a missile. I don't remember the pain of the impact. I remember the sound, the screech of tearing metal, a sound so loud it seemed to vibrate in my teeth rather than my ears. That was the last thing I ever heard. When I woke up in the ICU, the world was moving, but it was mute. The nurse was mouthing words, her face contorted in what looked like concern, but she was a silent film projected on a wall. The doctors used big, sterile words to sanitize the tragedy. Traumatic bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. It meant the wires were cut. The connection was severed. The auditory nerve had been crushed in the violent whiplash of the crash. A judge who cannot hear the plea cannot give the sentence. I didn't just lose my hearing. I lost my purpose. I was forced to retire, trading my robes for a cardigan, my gavel for a cane. I moved back to Blackwood, my family's estate. It was a sprawling Victorian manor, built for noise. It was built for grand parties, for the clinking of crystal glasses, for children running down the mahogany hallways. Now, without my wife Eleanor and without sound, it was a tomb, and I was the ghost haunting the hallways. The silence at Blackwood was different than the silence of the court. It was colder. I would sit in my leather armchair in the library, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of afternoon sunlight. I imagined I could hear the grandfather clock ticking, but I knew it was just a phantom memory. The world had become a flat, two-dimensional screen. My daughter, Clara, moved in to take care of me. She brought her husband, Richard. Clara was my heart. She had always been soft, an artist who painted in pastel colors I didn't quite understand, but always admired. She looked so much like her mother. The same anxious eyes, the same delicate hands. She treated me like a piece of fragile porcelain that might shatter if handled too roughly. Richard was different. Richard dealt in money, hedge funds, high-risk capital, leverage. He was a man of sharp angles and expensive suits. He smiled too much. His handshakes were firm, bordering on crushing, as if every greeting was a dominance display. "We're here for you, Thomas," he had mouthed slowly, exaggerating the syllables during that first week. "We'll handle everything." For 3 years, they were my lifeline, my translators, my wardens. They handled my bills because I couldn't use the phone. They ordered my food at restaurants because I couldn't hear the specials. They managed my appointments. I sat in my chair, day after day, reading their lips. I became an expert in the geometry of mouths. I watched the way Richard's lips thinned when he was stressed, the way Clara's chin trembled when she was tired. I was grateful. I told myself this every day. "You are lucky, Thomas. You are a burden, a broken old man, and they have sacrificed their freedom to nurse you." I believed that. I believed it with the same conviction I used to hand down verdicts. But belief is a dangerous thing when you are blind or deaf to the truth. I thought I was being cared for. I didn't know I was being managed. The change happened on a Tuesday, exactly 3 years after the accident. Dr. Harris was a specialist in biodigital integration. He worked on the bleeding edge of medicine, in a private clinic that smelled of ozone and antiseptic. He had communicated with me via a tablet, experimental, but promising. We bypassed the damaged nerves. We go straight to the brainstem. I went alone. I told Clara I was going for a routine checkup with my cardiologist. I wanted it to be a surprise. If it failed, I would bear the disappointment alone in the silence. If it worked, well, that would be a miracle. I sat in the chair, the leather cold against my neck. The device was a small, sleek node behind my ear, wired internally. "Ready, Thomas?" Dr. Ayres typed on the screen. I nodded. My hands gripped the armrest so hard my knuckles turned white. He tapped a key. It wasn't like the movies. There was no swell of orchestral music. No angels singing. It started as a crackle. A dry, violent sound, like dead wood snapping in a fire. It spiked through my head, a flash of white-hot sensory input. Then a high-pitched whine. It made me clench my teeth until my jaw ached. It was ugly. It was static. And then the hum, a low, steady, rhythmic drone. I blinked, looking around the room for the source. My eyes landed on the vent in the ceiling. The air conditioner. I was hearing the air conditioner. Thomas. The sound hit me like a physical blow. It was tinny, metallic, as if coming through a long copper pipe. It lacked the warmth I remembered, but it was distinct. It was a word. I looked at Dr. Ayres. His mouth was moving, and the sound was syncing with the image. I gripped the arms of the chair. Tears, hot and fast, burned my eyes. I hadn't cried in 3 years. Not even when I retired. "I can hear you," I whispered. My own voice boomed in my head. It sounded strange, foreign, deeper than I remembered, rusty from disuse. I sounded like a stranger. "It worked," Dr. Ayres smiled. The sound of his breath escaping his lips was audible. A soft hiss. "But be careful," he warned, his voice grave. "Your brain is fragile. It has been starved of input for too long. Loud noises will hurt. Chaos will confuse you. You need to acclimate slowly." I nodded, wiping my face with a trembling hand. "I don't care about the pain," I rasped. "I have the world back." I walked out of the clinic and into the city. It was terrifying. A car horn blasted, and I physically jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sound of shoes scuffing on the pavement sounded like sandpaper dragging across my eardrum. A siren in the distance wailed like a banshee. It was abrasive. It was overwhelming. It was beautiful. I hailed a taxi. I sat in the back, closing my eyes, just listening to the tires hum on the asphalt and the rhythm of the turn signal. Click-clack, 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 clack. A plan formed in my mind, a childish, wonderful plan. My 70th birthday was this Saturday, 4 days away. Clara was throwing a party at Blackwood. It was to be a small affair, mostly Richard's business associates, and a few old friends from the court. I would wait. I wouldn't tell them yet. I wanted to see their faces. I would walk into the party, stand up from my wheelchair, and tap a glass with a spoon. The sound would ring out, and I would offer a toast. I would hear Clara's laugh. I would hear Richard's congratulations. It would be the greatest surprise of her life. I smiled at my reflection in the taxi window. The gray-haired man looking back at me didn't look like a ghost anymore. He looked like a boy with a secret gift hidden behind his back. I didn't know then that the gift was a bomb. And I was about to pull the pin. I arrived at Blackwood in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn that looked like bruised fingers stretching toward the house. I stood at the bottom of the stone steps for a long moment, just listening. For 3 years, this view had been a silent postcard. Now, it was a symphony. I heard the wind rustling through the ancient oak trees, a sound like dry silk rubbing together. I heard the distant, rhythmic chirping of a cricket hidden somewhere in the ivy. It was the sigh of the earth, a sound I had missed more than music, more than laughter. It was the sound of existence. I walked up the steps, the gravel crunching loudly under my soles. A violent, satisfying grit. I reached for my key and fumbled, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the clinic. I slid the brass key into the lock. Click. The sound was sharp, mechanical, and precise. It echoed in the cavernous entryway as I pushed the heavy oak door open. I stepped into the foyer. The house smelled of lemon polish and old paper, a scent I knew well, but now it seemed accompanied by the low-frequency hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen, and the settling groans of the timber frame. The house was breathing. My instinct, the habit of a lifetime of fatherhood, was to call out, "I'm home." The traffic was terrible. I opened my mouth, the air ready in my lungs. But something stopped me, a hesitation born of 3 years of invisibility. I was used to being the ghost. I was used to entering a room and having no one look up because I made no noise that I was aware of. I closed the door softly. I turned the handle so the latch wouldn't click. Silence. I stood there, soaking in the stillness, letting my auditory cortex map the space. And then I heard it. It came from the library, down the hall to the left. The heavy mahogany door was ajar, leaving a gap no wider than a finger. Voices. "Can't keep stalling him, Richard. It's been 3 weeks since the last notice." It was Clara. Her voice was higher than I remembered, pitched in a key of tight, vibrating anxiety. It wasn't the soothing, melodic voice she used when she sat by my chair and brushed my hair. It was the voice of a woman walking on a wire. I crept close. My shoes were soft-soled loafers on the Persian runner. I was silent. I was a spy in my own kingdom. I know, a deep voice replied. Richard. His voice was smooth, resonant, a baritone that usually projected confidence. But from this angle, stripped of the visual distraction of his smiling face, I heard something else, an edge, a serrated sharpness. "The lawyers are asking for the wet signature, Clara. Electronic won't cut it for a transfer this size. If we push too hard, he might get stubborn," Clara said. I heard the sound of pacing. Soft, frantic footsteps. You know how he is when he feels cornered. I froze. My hand hovered over the door handle, trembling. "I know how he is," Richard snapped. The veneer of patience cracked. "The old goat is senile. He sits there staring at dust motes. But he's still a judge deep down. If he smells a rat, he clamps down. Sunio, old goat." The words hit me with the force of a physical slap. My breath hitched in my throat. I felt a sudden, dizzying rush of blood to my head. This was the man who, just this morning, had patted my shoulder and called me sir. "He's not senile, Richard," Clara sighed. "Sound weary. He's just isolated. He's lonely." "Exactly," Richard said, "which makes him malleable." I heard the distinct clink of glass against glass, ice being dropped into a tumbler, the glug-glug-glug of heavy liquor being poured. It was 4,000 p.m. "He trusts us to manage the estate," Richard continued, his voice wet with drink. "He doesn't need to know the complexities. He doesn't need to know the estate is bleeding out." My heart slammed against my ribs. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded deafening to my own ears. I was terrified they would hear it. Bleeding out? I had millions in municipal bonds, a diversified portfolio, commercial real estate in the city. I was a wealthy man. I had built a fortress of security for my family. "You promised the tech investment would pay off." Clara's voice cracked, wavering into a whine. "You said we would double his money before he ever noticed the withdrawal." I leaned closer, pressing my ear toward the gap in the door. I stopped breathing. "The market turned." "Clara," Richard hissed. The ice in his glass rattled. "It's not my fault. The volatility killed the leverage. But I can fix it. I always fix it." "How?" Clara whispered. "How do you fix a $4 million hole?" I felt the blood drain from my face. $4 million. Gone. "I just need the capital," Richard said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "We need him to sign the springing power of attorney on Saturday, at the party. Richard, once I have control, I liquidate the commercial properties on 5th Street. I cover the margin call on the main account. I shuffle the losses into the shell company." "And Dad?" Clara asked. "What happens to Dad?" "He goes to Sunset Haven," Richard said casually. "It's a nice facility. Better than he needs. He won't know the difference. He lives in his head anyway." I closed my eyes. The pain was sharper than the car accident. This was a structural failure. The beams of my life, my trust, my love, my legacy were snapping one by one. "And the best part," Richard said, taking a sip of his drink, "nobody goes to jail. Jail. The word hung in the air like toxic smoke. They weren't just bad with money. They were criminals. They were embezzlers. And my daughter, my sweet, artistic Clara, was an accessory. I backed away. My legs felt weak, like I was walking through deep water. My equilibrium, already fragile from the surgery, threatened to fail me. I grabbed the hallway table to steady myself. Focus, Thomas, I told myself. Do not collapse. You are not a victim. You are a judge. I retreated to the foyer, moving backward with the agonizing slowness of a thief. I reached the front door. I needed to reset the scene. I needed to be the deaf man they thought they owned. I opened the heavy front door and slammed it shut. Hard. Bam. The vibration shook the floorboards. I waited 5 seconds, counting them out in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I shuffled my feet loudly on the wood, dragging my heels. I cleared my throat. A guttural, unrefined sound. Hello? I called out. I slurred the vowels on purpose. I flattened the intonation, pitching my voice into the monotonous, uncontrolled drone of the profoundly deaf. It was a performance I had never had to fake before, but I channeled every memory of the last 3 years. Claire, guess? Richard good? Richard appeared instantly at the end of the hall. He moved with a speed that betrayed his panic. His face was flushed, a sheen of sweat shining on his high forehead. He was tucking his shirt in, smoothing his hair. But the moment he saw me, the mask slammed down. He forced a wide, blinding smile. It was grotesque. It was the smile of a shark sensing blood in the water. Thomas, welcome back, he shouted. The volume was assaultive. He was screaming at me, enunciating every syllable with exaggerated jaw movements, like he was talking to a slow-witted toddler. Did you have a good checkup? I looked at him. I looked at the man I had welcomed into my home, the man I had treated like the son I never had. I saw the tightness around his eyes. I saw the tremor in his left hand, the one he tried to hide behind his back. I saw the fear. I smiled vacantly. I let my jaw go slack. I pointed to my ears and shook my head, mimicking the gesture of helplessness I had used 1,000 times. Still silent. I hear nothing. Richard exhaled. A massive rush of air. His shoulders dropped 3 inches. The tension left his body, replaced by a smug, toxic relief. Good to see you, Dad, he said in a normal volume, his voice dripping with condescension. You nearly gave me a heart attack, you old spook. He walked up to me and clapped a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a comfort, it was a check. A test of solidity. Go sit down, he said, steering me toward the living room. We'll get you some soup. You look tired. He turned his head back toward the library, shouting for Clara. It's fine, honey. He's home. I pulled away gently and pointed toward the stairs. I mimed sleeping. I walked to my room, one heavy step at a time. The stairs creaked under my weight, a sound I now cherished, for it told me I was still real. I entered my bedroom and closed the door. I didn't lock it. A locked door arouses suspicion. I sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were trembling so violently I had to clasp them together in my lap. I looked at the silver-framed photo of my late wife, Eleanor, on the nightstand. She was smiling, frozen in a time when the world was loud and honest. They are stealing from us, Ella, I whispered. The sound of my whisper was sibilant, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. They are going to put me in a home. They are going to erase us. A tear slid down my cheek. It was hot and salty. It wasn't a tear of joy for the return of my hearing anymore. It was a tear of mourning. I was mourning the death of my family. I was mourning the illusion of love. The father in me wanted to burst into the library, to scream, to shake Clara until she remembered who she was. I wanted to beg them to stop, but the judge knew better. In court, you don't act on a hunch. You don't scream at the defendant during the arraignment. You wait. You gather evidence. You let the accused build their own gallows, plank by plank. You let them hang themselves with their own rope. I wiped the tear away. I took a deep breath, listening to the air fill my lungs. The silence was gone. The glass prison had shattered. Now, the hunt began. The next morning, the house felt different. It was no longer a tomb. It was a factory of noise, and every sound was aggressive. I woke to the groan of the plumbing in the walls, a rushing, watery gurgle that sounded like the house was choking. Downstairs, the refrigerator compressor kicked on with a shudder that vibrated through the floorboards. I lay in bed for 10 minutes, just listening. I catalogued the sounds of the occupation. Heavy footsteps in the hallway, Richard marching like he owned the timber. Lighter, frantic steps. Clara pacing. The thud of a door. The clatter of a dropped item. Every sound was a reminder of the lies surrounding me. The silence had been a buffer, a soft cotton wrapping that protected me from their true nature. Now, the wrapping was torn away, and I was exposed to the raw, grinding friction of their deceit. I dressed slowly. I chose a cardigan with a frayed cuff. I needed to look the part. The shambling, slightly unkempt invalid, the vegetable, as Richard had so eloquently put it. I entered the kitchen at 8 a.m. The room was flooded with morning light, usually a cheerful sight, but today it felt harsh. It illuminated the dust on the baseboards and the tension in the air. Richard sat at the head of the table. He was reading the Financial Times. The paper snapped open like a barrier between him and the world. Clara was by the window, staring out at the overgrown garden. She was hugging her elbows, her posture defensive. I shuffled to my chair, making sure to drag my feet. I sat down heavily. Richard didn't look up. He took a bite of dry toast. Crunch, crunch. The sound was amplified by my new hearing. It sounded wet and violent, like small bones snapping. He chewed with his mouth slightly open, a sound of arrogance I had never noticed when I could hear. Or perhaps he had only developed it now that he thought no one was listening. "Did you call the bank?" Clara asked without turning around. Her voice was thin, brittle. Richard swallowed. "Gulp. I told you, Clara. Stop nagging." "The transfer's queued. Once the old man signs the POA tomorrow, the funds release on Monday morning." "It feels wrong, Richard," she whispered. "Moving the assets before he's what?" Richard snapped, rattling the newspaper. "Dead? He's already dead, Clara. Look at him." I stared at the salt shaker, keeping my face entirely blank. I focused on a single grain of salt trapped in the cap. "I am a statue," I told myself. "I am stone. He's just eating his oatmeal," Richard sneered. "He doesn't know if it's Tuesday or Christmas. He's happy. Ignorance is bliss." He turned the page of the newspaper. Swish, snap. "We are saving the estate," Richard added, his voice dropping to a smooth, lying purr. "We are doing what he would want if his brain wasn't turned to mush." My hand tightened around my spoon. The metal dug into my palm. The urge to drive the spoon into the table, to stand up and roar. Objection was a physical pain in my chest. The swinging door to the pantry pushed open. A woman entered. I recognized her vaguely. Elena. She had been hired 2 months ago after Richard fired Mrs. Higgins, our housekeeper of 20 years, claiming budget cuts. Elena was in her 50s, a woman with a face etched by hard work and weary resignation. She wore a simple, eerie uniform that was slightly too large. Her hands were rough, red from scrubbing, and she carried a silver coffee pot. "Coffee, sir?" she asked Richard. Her voice was low, accented with the cadence of Eastern Europe. Richard didn't lower the paper. "Leave it, and get the hell out of the way. You're blocking the light." Elena didn't flinch. She was used to this. She was invisible, just like me. She poured the coffee into his mug. The dark liquid gurgled, her hand trembled slightly, and a single drop splashed onto the saucer. "Watch it," Richard barked, jerking his paper away. "Incompetent. God, it's like living in a halfway house." "Sorry, sir," Elena murmured. She turned to me. I watched her approach. I saw her eyes. They weren't vacant like the servants Richard preferred. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a profound, aching pity. She set a glass of water down in front of me. She reached for the pitcher to fill it. She leaned in close. To anyone watching, it looked like she was simply checking the level of the glass. But I heard the change in her breathing. It hitched. Richard rustled his paper, distracted by a stock index. "Be careful," she whispered. The sound was barely a breath. It was softer than the rustle of the paper. It was a ghost of a sentence. I didn't react. I kept staring at my oatmeal, stirring it in a slow, clockwise circle. Slop. Slop. She poured the water. Glug, glug. They talk when you're in the room, she whispered again, her lips barely moving. They think you're furniture. They are bad people. My heart hammered against my ribs. Thump, thump. Thump. She knew. She didn't know I could hear, but she knew the score. She knew I was being isolated. She saw the wolves circling the wounded elk. In a house of liars, I had found one honest soul. She pulled back quickly, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes darting toward Richard. I took a bite of oatmeal. It tasted like ash. Richard lowered the paper slowly. The rustling stopped. The silence in the kitchen suddenly became sharp, charged with static. He looked at Elena, then he looked at me. Did she say something to you, Thomas? Richard asked. His voice was casual, but I heard the undercurrent of paranoia. He was a man building a house of cards. He feared the slightest breeze. This was if I looked at him, if I showed confusion, if I looked at Elena, he would know. I counted to 3 in my head. 1, 2, 3. I kept chewing. I lifted my hand and tapped my ear, shaking my head with a vacant, goofy smile. Then I pointed past Richard toward the window where a blue jay had landed on the feeder. Bird, I said. My voice was loud, flat, uncontrolled. Blue, bird. I clapped my hands together once. A childish, senile gesture. Richard stared at me. His eyes bored into my skull. He was looking for the spark of intelligence, the glimmer of the judge. He didn't find it. He let out a short, cold laugh. A dry sound, like dead leaves crunching. Useless, he muttered. Totally gone. He turned his glare to Elena. What are you standing there for? Get the car brought around. I have a tea time. Yes, sir, Elena said. She hurried out, head down. I watched Richard return to his paper. Just you wait, Richard, I thought, the inner voice cold and precise. Elena was an ally, or at least a witness. She had seen the cruelty. When the time came, when I brought the gavel down, I would make sure she was safe. But for now, I had to be the furniture. I scraped the bottom of my bowl. Scrape, scrape. I let the sound grate on Richard's nerves. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was all I had. Stop that noise, Thomas, Richard snapped. I didn't stop. I scraped again, harder. I smiled at the blue jay. The game was afoot. The afternoon stretched out, hot and still. The house settled into a deceptive peace. I sat in the sunroom, a book resting unread in my lap, waiting for the exodus. I watched Richard leave first. He wore his golf attire, a pastel polo that stretched too tight across his chest and carried his clubs with a careless swagger. I heard the aggressive vroom of his Porsche starting in the driveway, followed by the crunch of gravel as he sped off toward the country club. Clara was next. She donned a wide-brimmed hat and gardening gloves, retreating to the rose garden at the far end of the estate. She was fleeing the house, I realized. She couldn't bear the silence of the rooms she helped corrupt. I waited 10 minutes. I counted the seconds by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Tick, tock, tick, tock. When I was certain the coast was clear. I didn't shuffle this time. I walked with purpose, my stride lengthening. I headed straight for the library. The library was cool and smelled of old paper and leather, a scent that used to bring me comfort. Now it smelled of Richard. The acrid linger of his expensive cigars had seeped into the curtains, masking the scent of the books. It was a subtle act of colonization. I approached the desk. It was a massive double-pedestal mahogany piece that had belonged to my father. It was the command center of the Vance estate. I tried the center drawer, locked. I knew Richard's habits. He was a man of arrogance, and arrogance breeds sloppiness. He believed a simple brass lock was enough to deter a senile old man. He didn't think I had the dexterity, let alone the wit to bypass it. He had forgotten that before I was a judge, I was a prosecutor. I had spent hours reviewing evidence on break-in. I knew the mechanics of a tumbler lock, as well as I knew the penal code. I scanned the desk surface. I found a silver letter opener and a sturdy paperclip in a crystal dish. I straightened the paperclip, my fingers moving with a precision that surprised me. I inserted the tension tool, the letter opener, into the bottom of the keyway. I slid the paperclip in. Click. I felt the first pin bind. I closed my eyes. relying entirely on the feedback, vibrating through the metal. In a way, my years of deafness had prepared me for this. My tactile sense was heightened. I could feel the microscopic shift of the cylinder. Click. Second pin. Click. Third pin. The lock rotated. The sound was soft, a metallic thunk of surrender. I pulled the drawer open. It slid out on well-oiled tracks. I looked inside, and my stomach turned over. It wasn't a file drawer. It was a graveyard. There were no organized folders. No labeled tabs. It was a chaotic jumble of crumpled paper, unopened envelopes, and legal notices. I began to sift through the strata of ruin. First, the bank statements. Red ink everywhere. Overdraft notices. Insufficient funds. Then the notices of overdue payments. The property tax on the commercial buildings hadn't been paid in 2 quarters. The maintenance fees on the estate were delinquent. But at the bottom, buried under the negligence, I found the malice. Gambling slips. They weren't from a casino. They were from a bookie. Carbon copy slips with scribbled odds. Golden State versus Lakers, $50,000. Loss. Kentucky Derby, $20,000 on Midnight Runner. Loss. Boxing. Heavyweight title. $75,000. Loss. My hands shook, rattling the paper. This wasn't just mismanagement. This wasn't a bad market, as Richard had claimed. This was an addiction. He was hemorrhaging my life's work into the pockets of loan sharks. He was a degenerate gambler masquerading as a financier. He wasn't investing my money. He was incinerating it. Then I found the document they had discussed. It was in a thick manila envelope. The top page was a birthday card. Cheerful and bright. Happy 70th birthday, Dad. It read in bubbly, generic font, but stapled carefully underneath the card, hidden so that a quick glance would only reveal the greeting, was a legal document. Durable power of attorney. I scanned the text. It was predatory, granting Richard Sterling full and unencumbered control of all assets. Real and personal, power to liquidate, transfer, and sell. Authority to make all medical decisions, including long-term care placement. And the trigger clause, effective immediately upon signature. It wasn't a stewardship. It was a coup. Beneath it was a glossy brochure. Sunset Haven, Assisted Living and Memory Care. I opened it. It showed smiling seniors playing chess. But I knew the place. It was a state-run facility 2 hours north, known for being understaffed and over-medicated. It was a warehouse for the discarded. They weren't just going to rob me. They were going to delete me. I reached into the hollowed-out spine of an old copy of Blackstone's commentaries on the shelf behind me. I pulled out my burner phone, a cheap prepaid device I had bought the day after the surgery. I opened the camera app. My hands were slippery with sweat. Snap! The gambling debts. Snap. The foreclosure warnings. Snap. The power of attorney. Snap. The brochure. I was gathering evidence. I was building the case. Suddenly, a sound cut through the air like a knife, the heavy rumble of an engine. I froze. I glanced at the window. Richard's Porsche was rolling up the driveway. He was back. He was hours early. Panic, cold and electric, shot through my veins. I heard the garage door opening, a grinding mechanical roar. I shoved the papers back into the drawer. I tried to arrange them exactly as they had been. The mess, the chaos. I slammed the drawer shut. I jammed the paperclip back into the lock. I tried to rake the pins. Click. Nothing. Click. It wouldn't lock. The tumbler was jammed. Footsteps. Heavy, fast footsteps, echoing on the hardwood of the foyer. Clara? Richard's voice boomed. He sounded agitated. Where the hell are my other clubs? He was coming down the hall. I abandoned the lock. I threw the paperclip into the trash can. I spun around and dropped into my leather armchair. I grabbed the nearest book from the side table. I opened it to a random page. The doorknob turned. Richard walked in. He stopped dead in the doorway. The air in the room changed instantly. It went from the stillness of a sanctuary to the tension of a cage match. He looked at the desk. He looked at me. "What are you doing in here?" he asked. His voice was sharp, suspicious. I didn't react. I kept my eyes glued to the page. I didn't blink. I forced my breathing to be shallow, rhythmic. He walked into the room. He tossed his golf hat onto the sofa. He was staring at me. I could feel his gaze on the side of my face, like a heat lamp. "I thought you were in the sunroom," he muttered. He walked over to the desk. He looked at the center drawer. He reached out and pulled the handle. It slid open. The silence that followed was deafening. He looked at the papers. Then slowly he turned his head toward me. His eyes narrowed into slits. He looked like a wolf, sniffing the air for a scent. "Did you open this?" he whispered. He walked around the desk. He moved toward me. I kept reading. The words on the page were a blur, something about maritime law, but I locked my eyes onto them. Richard stood over me. His shadow fell across the page, blocking the light. "Can you hear me, old man?" he murmured. He leaned down. His face was inches from my ear. I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, and the expensive cologne he wore to mask the scent of his fear. "I know you're in there," he whispered. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could see it beating through my cardigan. Thump, thump, thump. Then I saw him raise his hands out of the corner of my vision. He cupped his palms. My instinct screamed at me. "Flinch. Cover your ear. Protect yourself." Dr. Aris had warned me. Loud noises will hurt. Richard clapped his hands together. Hard. Right next to my right ear. Clap. The sound was like a gunshot inside my skull. It wasn't just noise. It was pain. A white-hot spike drove itself through my eardrum and down into my jaw. My vision fractured for a microsecond. The auditory nerve, fresh and raw, shrieked in protest. Every muscle fiber in my body wanted to recoil. My shoulder wanted to jerk up. My eyes wanted to squeeze shut. My mouth wanted to scream. I killed the reaction. I forced my muscles to turn to stone. I severed the connection between the sensation and the response. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I didn't tense my neck. I kept my eyes on the word jurisprudence. The ringing in my ear was a high-pitched scream, a dentist drill, boring into my brain. Richard stared at me. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. He was waiting for the micro-expression. The dilation of the pupil, the twitch of a finger. He saw nothing. He saw a vegetable reading a book he couldn't understand. Richard exhaled. A long, shaky breath. "Deaf as a post," he said aloud. He sounded disappointed, but mostly relieved. He laughed, a short, nervous bark. "Christ, I'm losing it," he muttered to himself. "Paranoid? It's just an old lock." He walked back to the desk. I heard the jingle of his keys. He inserted his own key into the lock and turned it click. He patted the desk. Safe and sound. He walked out of the library whistling a tune. It was an upbeat, cheerful melody, the sound of a man who thinks he has gotten away with murder. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade down the hallway. I waited until I heard the refrigerator door open in the kitchen. Only then did I let the book fall from my hands. I slumped forward, gripping the arms of the chair. I gasped for air, my lungs burning as if I had been holding my breath underwater for minutes. I touched my ear. It was throbbing. I was safe. For now, but I had the evidence. The photos were in the phone. The phone was in the book. The paper trail was complete. Now, all I needed was the confession. Thursday broke with a gray, bruised sky. The light filtering into Blackwood was flat and colorless, turning the hallways into tunnels of shadow. It was the kind of weather that made the joints of the old house ache. I could hear the timber groaning under the shift in barometric pressure, a low, rhythmic creaking that sounded like the house was counting down. I had spent the night awake, staring at the ceiling, prosecuting my daughter in the courtroom of my mind. Charge 1, conspiracy to defraud. Charge 2, elder abuse. Charge 3, betrayal of blood. But the defense attorney in my head, the father, kept raising objections.
"She is afraid," he argued. "She is being manipulated. She is a victim of coercive control." I needed to know the truth. I needed to know if Clara was a hostage or a conspirator. I found her in the conservatory, which she had converted into a studio. It was a glass-walled room at the back of the house, usually flooded with light. Today, rain lashed against the panes, blurring the garden into a smear of wet green. Clara was standing before an easel.
She wasn't painting. She was attacking the canvas. I stood in the doorway, silent, watching her. In her youth, Clara had painted landscapes, gentle watercolors, soft impressionist gardens, scenes full of light and air. She had a delicate touch. The canvas before her now was a violent storm of charcoal and dark acrylics, jagged black lines slashed across a muddy gray background. It looked like a cage. It looked like a scream. She looked miserable. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, strands escaping to stick to her tear-stained cheeks. She wore an oversized smock covered in paint smears, but underneath I saw how thin she had become. Her collarbones were sharp ridges. Richard was feeding off the estate, but the estate was feeding off Clara. I stepped into the room. My footfalls on the tile were audible, but the rain against the glass masked them. I walked until I was right behind her. I reached out and placed my hand on her shoulder. She jumped, gasping, and spun around. Her brush clattered to the floor. Jesus. Dad. She pressed a hand to her chest. You scared me. She looked at me, her eyes wide, searching for the usual vacancy. She expected the empty smile. She expected the vegetable. I didn't smile. I looked at her with an intensity I hadn't shown in 3 years. I summoned the focus I used to reserve for a hostile witness. Clara, I said. My voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. It was the voice of a man who hadn't spoken intentionally in years. She froze, her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at my lips, as if trying to comprehend the physics of what had just happened. Dad, she whispered, you spoke? I nodded slowly. I gripped her shoulder tighter, anchoring her. I needed her to feel the reality of me. Happy, I rasped. I enunciated the word carefully. Are you happy? Tears filled her eyes instantly, welling up and spilling over her lashes. It was a visceral reaction, a dam breaking. Oh, Dad, she sobbed. She threw her arms around me. She buried her face in my chest, weeping. I held her. I smelled the turpentine and the faint nostalgic scent of her vanilla perfume, the same one she had worn since she was a teenager. For a moment I was just a father holding his crying child. My heart broke. I wanted to tell her I knew everything. I wanted to tell her I could fix it. I miss you, she choked out into my shirt. I miss you so much. It's so hard. It's all so hard. I pulled back gently. I held her by the arms, forcing her to look at me. This was the moment, the cross-examination. I looked deep into her eyes, searching for the bottom of her soul. Money, I said. Her breath hitched. Her pupils dilated. Money, I repeated, making it a question. Do you need money? The air in the room seemed to freeze. The sound of the rain faded into the background. Clara pulled back an inch. The vulnerability on her face began to warp. Fear warred with hope. I saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. I saw the terrifying rapid-fire processing of consequences. Option A, tell the truth. Admit they were broke. Admit Richard had gambled it away. Ask for help. Consequence. Richard would be furious. The shame would be public, but would be free. Option B, lie. Protect the scheme. Protect Richard. Consequence. She stays in the cage, but the secret remains safe. Dad, she stammered. Her lip quivered. She looked at my eyes. She saw the clarity there. For a second, I thought she was going to do it. I thought she was going to fall to her knees and confess. Then her eyes shifted. She looked past me, toward the open door of the conservatory, toward the hallway where Richard might be walking, toward the phantom presence of her husband. I saw the change happen physically. Her spine stiffened. The softness in her face hardened into a mask of porcelain brittle resolve. The daughter vanished. The accomplice arrived. She wiped her face aggressively with the back of her hand. She stepped out of my reach. No, Dad, she said. Her voice was loud, too loud. It was a performance for the walls. We don't need money, she declared, her tone bright and fake. We are rich, you are rich. Everything is perfect. My heart stopped. It didn't break, it turned to ice. Perfect, she repeated, a desperate mantra. She walked over to a side table and grabbed a notepad and a thick marker. She wrote furiously, the marker squeaking against the paper. She ripped the page off and held it up to my face, as if I were a child who couldn't understand spoken English. Everything is fine. We're happy. The letters were blocky and uneven. I looked at the note. I looked at the black ink bleeding into the paper. Then I looked at her. She was trembling, but her chin was high. She was lying to my face. She was looking into the eyes of the man who raised her, the man who was offering her a lifeline, and she was choosing to cut the rope. She was sealing my fate to save her own skin. I looked at the note for a long time. I needed to memorize it. This was the evidence that would convict her. I nodded slowly. I forced a confused, lap-sided smile onto my face. I reached out and patted her hand, a patronizing senile gesture. I took the note from her. I folded it carefully and put it in my pocket. "Good," I mumbled. "Good." Clara exhaled, a sound of relief that sickened me. "Yes, Dad, it's good. Go rest now." I turned around. I walked out of the conservatory. I walked down the hallway, the sound of the rain drumming a funeral march against the windows. That was the moment Thomas the father died. He didn't die in the car crash. He didn't die on the operating table. He died in the conservatory, killed by a lie written in black marker. And as I walked toward the library, I felt the shift. My posture straightened slightly. My stride lengthened. Thomas the judge took the bench. There would be no plea bargain. There would be no leniency. The silence was gone. Now the sentencing began. Friday arrived, not with the promise of the weekend, but with the tension a wire pulled to its breaking point. I sat at the kitchen island, a bowl of untouched fruit in front of me. I was wearing my morning mask, a slack jaw, a distant stare, hands folded passively on the marble countertop. Richard was across from me, but he wasn't eating. He was vibrating. He stood by the high-end espresso machine, violently tamping down coffee grounds. Thump, thump. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated. He spilled sugar on the counter and didn't wipe it up. The house was quiet, save for the aggressive hiss of the steam wand as Richard frothed milk. He was muttering to himself, a low, frantic stream of curses. Come on, you piece of junk." Then the phone rang. It was Richard's cell phone, resting on the granite island, not 3 feet from my elbow. The ringtone was a sharp, digital trill that cut through the steam and silence like a scalpel. Richard jumped. He bobbled the pitcher of milk, scalding his hand. Damn it. He lunged for the phone. He didn't pick it up to his ear. His hands were wet, sticky with milk. He tapped the green icon and hit speaker. He threw the phone back onto the counter as he grabbed a rag to wipe his hand. "Vance," a voice growled from the tiny speaker. The voice wasn't like the ones Richard used. Smooth, corporate, polished. This voice was textureless and cold. It sounded like gravel tumbling inside a cement mixer. "Marcus," Richard hissed, glancing quickly at me. I didn't blink. I stared at the banana in the fruit bowl. I focused on the brown spots on the yellow skin. "I am furniture," I chanted internally. "I am a deaf, old man eating fruit." "I told you not to call the house line, Marcus," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "It's risky. I don't care about your rules, Richard," the voice replied. The audio quality was crisp. I could hear the background noise on the other end, the indistinct murmur of a busy office, or perhaps a betting parlor. "I tried your mobile 3 times, Marcus continued. You didn't answer. I don't like being ghosted. It makes me nervous. And when I get nervous, I get expensive." "I was driving," Richard lied. "Look, I have it under control. Do you?" Marcus asked. The tone was mocking. "Because my sources tell me the margin call on the tech short came due yesterday, and you didn't pay. I need 2 days," Richard pleaded. He leaned over the counter, shouting at the phone now. Forgetting I was there. The old man turns 70 tomorrow. The party is tomorrow night. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The old man. I was just a timeline to them. A mechanism to unlock a vault. "He signs the power of attorney at 8:00 p.m., Richard said, his voice desperate. "I have the notary coming. Once the ink is dry, I have full access. I liquidate the bonds Monday morning. You get your money plus the vig by noon." I need my money Saturday night, Richard, Marcus said. I have partners who are less patient than I am. I can't liquidate on a Saturday night. Cash, Richard. Jewelry, I don't care. Scrape it together. Or I start breaking things. I'll have it, Richard hissed. He gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. Just back off. He better sign, Marcus said. Then I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Click, click. It was the sound of a retractable pen being clicked in and out. Rhythmic. Psychopathic. Click, click. If he doesn't sign, Marcus said softly. You're not the only one who gets hurt, Richard. Richard went silent. What does that mean? Your wife, Marcus said. Clara. She's a pretty thing. An artist, right? My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Clara, leave her out of this, Richard begged. His voice cracked. He sounded small. He sounded like a child. Accidents happen to wives too, Richard. Marcus said. The menace was absolute. Car brakes fail. Houses catch fire. It's a dangerous world. Click, click. Saturday night. Midnight. Don't disappoint me. The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone. He didn't move for a long time. He looked pale, sickly. The sweat on his forehead had gathered into large droplets that ran down his nose. He let out a scream of frustration, a strangled, guttural aura, and slammed his fist onto the granite counter. Damn! The fruit bowl jumped. I felt the vibration through the table. This was my cue. A deaf man would feel the vibration. A deaf man would react to the visual of a man slamming his fist. I looked up, startled. I widened my eyes in feigned confusion. I made a low, questioning noise in my throat. Richard looked at me. His eyes were wild, bloodshot. He looked through me. He didn't see a father-in-law. He saw a lifeline. He saw a meat shield between him and Marcus Sterling. It's fine, he shouted at me, waving his hand dismissively. Just dropped something. Go back to your fruit. He grabbed the phone and stormed out of the kitchen. I sat alone in the kitchen. The espresso machine was still hissing. My hands were trembling under the table. This had changed. Before, it was theft. It was betrayal. It was about money. Now it was life and death. Marcus Sterling was a name I knew from old case files. He was a loan shark, who operated under the guise of a private equity investor. He was vicious. He didn't make idle threats. If Richard failed, Marcus would come for the family. He would come for Clara. I looked at the phone Richard had left on the counter. No, he took it, but the conversation was burned into my memory. I closed my eyes. Clara had betrayed me. She had lied to me. She was willing to steal my fortune. But she was my daughter, and no one threatens my daughter. Not Richard. Not Marcus Sterling. I wasn't just gathering evidence for a fraud case anymore. I was preparing a defense against a violent incursion. I stood up. I walked to the sink and poured a glass of water. I drank it in one gulp. The trembling in my hands stopped. Richard was desperate. A desperate man is dangerous, erratic, prone to mistakes. But a patient man, a man who waits in the silence, he is the most dangerous thing in the room. I left the house at 2:11 p.m. I told Richard, through a series of elaborate gestures and a scribbled note, that I wanted to walk to the ducks. There was a small pond at the edge of the estate, bordering the public park. It was a route I used to take daily before the accident. A route that Richard considered harmless and contained. He waved me off without looking up from his laptop. He was manic, typing furiously, likely trying to juggle funds between shell accounts to hide the hemorrhage before the weekend audit. I walked down the long gravel driveway. The stones crunched loudly under my orthopedic shoes. Crunch, crunch, crunch. A rhythm that used to be a vibration in my shins, but was now a sharp, satisfying percussion. The wind was picking up. It whipped through the bare branches of the elms, creating a mournful, whistling song. I pulled my coat tighter. The cold bit at my ears, but I welcomed it. It felt real. It felt clean, unlike the stifling, overheated air of Blackwood. I didn't stop at the pond. I checked over my shoulder. The house was a looming gray silhouette on the hill, its windows looking like empty eyes. No one was following. I crossed the property line, stepping over the low stone wall and into the city park. I walked another quarter-mile, finding the secluded bench beneath a weeping willow. It was shielded from the road, hidden in a curtain of dormant vines. I sat down. My heart was racing, not from the exertion, but from the treason I was about to commit. I reached into the deep pocket of my coat and pulled out the burner phone. It felt heavy, like a loaded gun. I dialed the number from memory. It was a number I hadn't called in 3 years, but one does not forget the number of the man he raised from a junior clerk to the district attorney. It rang once, twice. District Attorney's Office. David Ross speaking. His voice was deeper than I remembered, more authoritative. He sounded tired. I took a breath. The air tasted of damp earth and decaying leaves. "David," I said. There was a silence on the other end, absolute and profound. "Hello?" David asked, his tone shifting from professional to confused. "Who is this?" "It's me, David," I said. My voice was steady, the baritone returning, stripping away the slurred facade I used at the house. "It's Judge Vance." I heard a sharp intake of breath. Hiss. Then the sound of a chair scraping back violently. "Judge?" David stammered. "Thomas, is that doubt that you can't." "I can," I interrupted. "I can hear you perfectly, David. The surgery was a success. I've been able to hear for 4 days. My God," David whispered. "Thomas, that's a miracle. Why haven't you told anyone? Why am I the first to know?" "Because," I said, leaning forward on the bench, "I am currently living in a crime scene." The joy in David's voice evaporated instantly, replaced by the sharp, metallic edge of the prosecutor. "Talk to me," he said. I told him everything. I spoke for 10 minutes without interruption. I detailed the conversation in the library, the gambling debts, the threats from Marcus Sterling, the springing power of attorney, the plan to liquidate the estate and dump me in Sunset Haven. I told him about Clara. That was the hardest part, admitting that my daughter was an accessory to the destruction of her own father. My voice cracked when I said it, but I forced the words out. "Jesus Christ," David breathed when I finished. "Richard Sterling, I always knew he was a slimeball, but this is grand larceny, conspiracy, elder abuse. I have photos," I added. "I have the gambling slips. I have the foreclosure notices. I have the POA. "That's enough," David said. "I'll send a squad car right now. I'll send a SWAT team if I have to. We'll pick him up for fraud and extortion. We can have him in a cell within the hour." "No," I said. "What do you mean, no?" David argued. "Judge, he's dangerous. You said he's desperate. He's dealing with loan sharks. If we arrest him now, David, what do we have?" I asked, channeling the Socratic method I used to use on him when he was a rookie. "We have intent." David hesitated. "We have mismanagement." "Exactly," I snapped. "We have intent. He hasn't stolen the main corpus yet. He hasn't signed the POA. If you arrest him now, he gets a lawyer. He claims he was managing the funds aggressively. He claims the gambling slips are old. He claims he was trying to save the estate from my medical bills." "He'll wiggle," David admitted. "He's slippery. He will walk," I corrected. "And Claire, she'll claim she was coerced, or worse. She'll stand by him. She'll say I'm senile and confused." I watched a squirrel scurry up the trunk of an oak tree. Nature continued, indifferent to my tragedy. "I need him to hang himself, David," I said softly. "I need him to attempt the theft. I need him to force the signature in front of witnesses." "That is incredibly risky," David warned. "You're putting yourself in the room with a cornered animal." "I can handle him," I said. "I handled murderers and cartel bosses for 30 years. Richard is just a greedy boy in a suit." "What do you need?" David asked. He had shifted gears. He was no longer the worried friend. He was the DA coordinating a sting. "The party is tomorrow night, 8 Arizona p.m. I said. "I need you there. You're on the guest list." "I'll be there, but I need eyes inside before the main event," I said. "I need someone who can move through the room unnoticed. Someone who can step in physically if Richard snaps." "Elias Thorne," David said immediately. I smiled. Elias, an ex-detective who had been pushed out of the force for being too rough with wife-beaters. He was now a private investigator. He was loyal, silent, and built like a vending machine. Perfect, I said. Can you get him in? I'll call the catering company, David said. I have leverage with the owner. Elias will be pouring champagne by 6:00 p.m. Tell him to watch Richard, I instructed, and tell him to watch Clara. I need to know if she tries to stop it. And if she doesn't, David asked gently, then she goes down with the ship, I said. My voice felt cold, detached. Judge, David said, his voice softening, are you sure you want to do this? We can stop this quietly. We can save you the humiliation. This isn't about humiliation, David. It's about the truth. I looked at the gray sky. Richard is going to try to raise me tomorrow, I said. He's going to stand up in front of our friends and declare me incompetent. He's going to try to take away my agency, my home, my life. I gripped the phone tight. I want him to try. I want him to hold the pen. And then I want to take it back. Okay, David said. We do it your way. I'll have unmarked units at the bottom of the hill. The moment you give the signal, we move. Good. And David? Yes, Judge. It's good to hear your voice. Yours too, Thomas. Be safe. I hung up. I powered down the phone and hid it deep in my coat. I sat on the bench for another moment. The trap was set. The players were in position. I thought about Clara. I thought about the little girl who used to sit on my lap and braid my hair while I read case files. I thought about the woman who painted cages in the conservatory. I was about to destroy her husband. I was about to dismantle her life. Am I doing this for justice? I asked myself. Or is this vengeance? The wind gusted, scattering dead leaves across my shoes. Does it matter? The judge in me answered. The law does not care about your feelings. The law cares about the fact. And the facts were simple. There was a stranger in my house, and he was holding a knife to my throat. I stood up. My knees popped. I buttoned my coat against the chill. I turned back toward Blackwood. The house waited on the hill, silent and imposing. It looked like a stage set for a tragedy. Act 1 is over, I whispered to the wind. I began the long walk back to the prison I was about to burn down. Dinner that night was a funereal affair. The storm had settled directly over Blackwood, the rain lashing against the dining room windows in sheets, turning the glass into shimmering black mirrors. Thunder rolled in the distance, a low tectonic growl that vibrated through the floorboards and up the legs of the antique mahogany table. I sat at my usual spot. The table was set for 3, but the distance between us felt oceanic. The chandelier was dimmed, casting long, wavering shadows that made the portraits of my ancestors on the walls look like they were weeping. I was hungry. I hadn't eaten since the oatmeal that morning, having skipped lunch to execute my escape to the park. My stomach growled. A low rumble that I prayed was covered by the thunder. Richard sat at the head of the table. He had changed into a fresh shirt, but he looked disheveled. His eyes were darting, checking his watch every few minutes. Tick, tick, tick. Clara emerged from the kitchen. She wasn't carrying a tray. She was carrying a single porcelain bowl with both hands, walking with the careful, deliberate steps of someone carrying a bomb. She placed the bowl in front of me. Here, Dad, she signed. Her hand movements were sloppy, half-hearted. She didn't make eye contact. She looked at my collarbone. I looked down at the soup, mushroom bisque. It was thick, creamy, and gray, a color that matched the sky outside. Steam curled off the surface in lazy spirals. It was my favorite soup, or it had been, years ago. Richard leaned forward. The candlelight caught the sheen of sweat on his upper lip. Eat up, Thomas, he said. His voice was too loud, too jovial. Clara made it special. Good for your bones. I picked up my spoon. The silver felt heavy, cold against my skin. I leaned in to smell the steam. I expected the earthy, rich aroma of roasted mushrooms, cream, and thyme. I smelled that, but underneath it, cutting through the savory notes like a razor blade, was something else. Acrid, bitter, chemical. It was faint, masked by the heavy cream, and the pepper, but to a man whose senses had been sharpened by 3 years of deprivation, it was undeniable. I knew that smell. It wasn't arsenic. It wasn't cyanide. It was crushing up pills. It was the chalky, metallic scent of benzodiazepines, or perhaps a high-dose antipsychotic. Dr. Evans. I remembered Richard mentioning him on the phone weeks ago. Get the script filled, Evans owes me. They weren't trying to kill me. That would be too messy. Too soon. They needed a body to sign the papers. They needed a pulse. They were trying to lobotomize me. They wanted me pliable. They wanted me drooling. They wanted to ensure that tomorrow night, when they put a pen in my hand, I would be nothing more than a meat puppet, nodding and smiling as I signed away my life. I looked at the soup. It was a swamp, a trap. I looked at Clara. She was sitting now, staring at her empty plate. She was picking at a loose thread on the tablecloth. She knew she had likely crushed the pills herself. My daughter. My little girl. She was poisoning her father to cover her husband's debts. A wave of nausea hit me, violent and sudden. It had nothing to do with hunger. It was the physical rejection of the betrayal. Go on, Dad, Richard urged. He was tapping his fingers on the table. Tap, tap, tap. It's getting cold. I couldn't eat it. One spoonful might be enough to slur my speech, to dull the sharp edge of my mind that I needed for tomorrow. But I couldn't just push it away. A hungry, confused old man doesn't refuse his favorite meal. I had to be the vegetable. I had to be the broken machine they believed I was. I gripped the spoon. I dipped it into the gray sludge. I lifted it halfway to my mouth. Then I focused on my hand. I thought about the tremors I had seen in the courtroom, defendants going through withdrawal, plaintiffs with Parkinson's, the rhythmic, uncontrollable shake. I forced my radial nerve to fire. My hand jerked. Clink. The spoon hit the side of the bowl. Steady, Richard muttered. I lifted it again. I intensified the tremor. My hand shook violently, the soup sloshing over the edges of the spoon. I looked at Richard. I let my jaw go slack. I let fear, real fear, fill my eyes. Then I spammed. I flung my arms sideways, a jagged, violent motion. The spoon flew from my hand. It cartwheeled through the air, flinging hot bisque in a wide arc. Splatter! The thick gray liquid hit the table. It hit the floor. It hit Richard's cuff. The bowl tipped over, rolling off the placemat and crashing onto the hardwood floor. Crash! The porcelain shattered. Soup exploded across the Persian rug like a gray oil slick. Damn it! Richard slammed his hands on the table and stood up, his chair screeching backward against the floor. Look at this mess. Look at him. He grabbed a napkin and furiously wiped at his sleeve. This is silk, for God's sake. I sat frozen, my hands still raised in the air, trembling. I didn't have to fake the shake anymore. The adrenaline was coursing through me. It's okay, Clara said. Her voice was small, terrified. She rushed around the table, grabbing a handful of napkins. She knelt on the floor, dabbing at the soup that was soaking into the expensive rug. He can't help it, Richard. It's the ataxia. The doctor said his motor skills might degrade. He's falling apart, Richard shouted, pacing the room. He's a disaster here. We can't have him like this tomorrow night. What if he throws a drink on the mayor? I'll feed him, Clara whispered, picking up the shards of the bowl. Clink, clink. I'll make sure he eats before the guests arrive. We need to get this done, Richard muttered, staring at me with pure loathing. We need the signature, and then we ship him north. I can't live in a nursing home anymore. I looked down at Clara. She was on her knees, scrubbing my poison out of the carpet. She was crying silently. I'm sorry, Dad, she signed to me, her hands shaking as she looked up. She wasn't apologizing for the soup. She was apologizing for the sin. I'll get you a sandwich, she said aloud. Ham and cheese. Is that okay? I stared at her, blankly. I nodded once. Richard stormed out of the room, muttering about dry cleaning. Clara finished cleaning the floor. She brought me a sandwich on a paper plate 10 minutes later. I ate it. I ate it like a wolf. It was dry. It was tasteless. But it was clean. I drank water from the tap. I went to my room early. I lay in the dark, listening to the rain hammer the roof. I had survived dinner, but I knew they were desperate now. The drug in the soup was plan A. If I was difficult tomorrow, if I resisted, Richard would move to plan B. And plan B would not involve soup. It would involve force. I lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling fan. Let them try, I thought. Let them come. The poison hadn't entered my blood, but the antidote was ready. The evening dragged on, heavy and suffocating. The storm outside had not abated. If anything, it had intensified. Thunder rattled the window panes in their frames, a constant, low-frequency bombardment that felt like the house was being shelled. I lay on my bed, fully dressed, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. I turned off the bedside lamp, preferring the darkness. Light required performance. In the dark, I could drop the slack-jawed mask. In the dark, I could clench my jaw and let the rage simmer. My room was the only place in Blackwood that still felt like mine. It smelled of cedar and old books, not the lemon polish and fear that permeated the rest of the house. I was running through the plan for tomorrow. David at the door, Elias in the kitchen. The timing of the toast. It was a fragile architecture. One slip, one unexpected variable, and Richard would win. Then the doorknob turned. It turned slowly, hesitantly. The latch clicked softly. I assumed it was Clara coming to check if the poison had settled my stomach, or perhaps to offer another drugged apology. I quickly relaxed my face, letting my mouth fall open slightly, my eyes glazing over. But it wasn't Clara. The door pushed open a foot, casting a slice of hallway light across the Persian rug. A small figure stood there. It was Leo, my grandson. He was 12 years old now, hovering on that precarious edge between childhood and the hardening of adolescence. He was tall for his age, with Clara's dark curls and, unfortunately, Richard's sharp chin. He stood in the doorway, clutching a comic book against his chest like a shield. He looked terrified. He peered into the gloom. "Grandpa?" he whispered. I didn't move. I stared at the wardrobe handle. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't latch it. He just pushed it to, until light was gone, sealing us in the gray obscurity of the room. We walked to the bed. His sneakers squeaked on the floor. He sat down on the edge of the mattress. Careful not to disturb me. I felt the mattress dip under his weight. He was so light, too light. He sat there for a long time in silence, his breathing shallow and rapid. I could hear the tiny wheeze in his chest. His asthma was acting up. Stress always triggered it. He reached out and began to trace the pattern on the quilt, a wedding ring design Eleanor had stitched 30 years ago.
"Hi, Grandpa,"
Leo whispered. His voice was trembling. "I know you can't hear me," he said, speaking to his knees. "Mom says your brain is broken. She says you're vacant." He stumbled over the word, vacant. "But I like coming in here," he continued. "It's quiet. Downstairs is loud." He pulled his legs up, hugging his knees, making himself a small target. "Dad is scary tonight," Leo whispered. My heart clenched. I wanted to sit up. I wanted to pull him into a hug and tell him he was safe. But I couldn't. Not yet. He was yelling at Mom in the kitchen, Leo said. He threw a glass. It smashed everywhere. I listened. This wasn't just a domestic dispute. This was the unraveling. He told her to shut up, Leo said, his voice dropping to a harsh mimicry of his father. He said. Leo paused, squeezing his eyes shut, as if trying to recall the exact words of a nightmare. He said, "We are buried, Clara. If the Cayman accounts don't clear by Monday, we are dead." Cayman accounts. The breath trapped in my lungs burned. So it wasn't just gambling debts paid to local sharks. Richard was moving capital offshore. He was laundering the estate. He was stealing the principal, hiding it in shell companies where U.S. jurisdiction couldn't touch it, and he said something about you. Leo whispered. A tear tracked through the dust on his cheek. He said, "The old man is just a signature now. He's not a person. He's an ATM." Leo wiped his nose on his sleeve. "I hate him," he said. The venom in his voice was pure, unadulterated by adult rationalization. "I hate him so much." Mom just cried. She always just cries. She never stops him. He looked at me then. In the dim light, I saw his eyes. They were old eyes, eyes that had seen too much weakness in the people who were supposed to be strong. "I wish you were here, Grandpa," Leo said. "I mean, really here, like before the accident." He reached out and took my hand. His fingers were cold. "You used to fix things," he said. "You fixed my bike. You fixed the tree house." He squeezed my hand. You're the only one who doesn't lie, he whispered. Everyone else in this house wears a mask. But you're just you, even if you are broken. The pain of it was unbearable. To hear this innocent boy, my blood, call himself alone in a house full of family. To hear him describe his mother's cowardice and his father's cruelty. I couldn't help it. I couldn't hug him. I couldn't speak. That would endanger the plan. If Leo knew I could hear, he might slip up. He might look at me differently when Richard was in the room. Richard would see it. Richard would know. But I had to give him something. A signal flare in the dark. I focused on my hand, the one Leo was holding. I squeezed back. Not a spasm. Not a tremor. A firm, deliberate 3-second squeeze. Pulse, pulse, pulse. Leo froze. He looked down at our hands. He looked up at my face. I kept my expression neutral, my eyes focused on the middle distance, but I let a single breath out through my nose. A long, steady exhale. Leo stared at me. He was searching. He was hoping. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask, "Did you feel that?" He just understood. Somewhere, deep in his intuition, he understood that the connection hadn't been an accident. "Okay," he whispered. A tiny smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Okay." He let go of my hand. He stood up. "Good night, Grandpa," he said. He walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the knob. "Get them," he whispered into the dark. Then he slipped out, closing the door softly. Click. I lay back against the pillows. A tear leaked from the corner of my eye and ran into my ear. Get them. It wasn't a request. It was a mandate. I thought about the offshore accounts. I thought about the broken glass in the kitchen. I thought about the fear in a 12-year-old's eyes. My resolve hardened into something denser than diamond. It turned into cold, black iron. I wasn't just fighting for my money anymore. I wasn't just fighting for my dignity. I was fighting for Leo. I was fighting to cut the cancer out of this family before it metastasized to the next generation. Richard thought he was dealing with a senile old man. He thought he was dealing with a victim. He didn't know that tonight, in the dark, he had just created his executioner. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow, the gavel comes down. Saturday night arrived wrapped in velvet and malice. The storm had passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean and dangerously still. Blackwood was lit up like a cathedral. Every chandelier was blazing, the light spilling out of the tall windows and onto the wet lawn, illuminating the lineup of luxury cars. Mercedes, BMWs, Jaguars. The sharks had arrived to feed. I sat in my wheelchair in the corner of the grand hall. I was dressed in my best tuxedo, though it hung a little loose on my frame now. I had allowed Clara to groom me, to comb my hair, to adjust my bow tie. I let her treat me like a doll because it made her hands shake. The room was a cacophony. For a man who had known silence for 3 years, it was an assault. The clinking of crystal flutes, the high-pitched laughter of socialites, the drone of gossip, the jazz quartet playing softly in the alcove. It was a wall of noise. But I picked through it. I tuned my hearing like a radio dial. I heard the whispers. "Looks terrible, doesn't he?" Heard Richard is leveraging the whole portfolio. Sad to see a great mind go soft. I scanned the room, looking for my marshals. I saw David Ross enter near the vestibule. He looked uncomfortable in a tuxedo, his eyes scanning the perimeter like the prosecutor he was. He caught my eye. A barely perceptible nod. He moved into the shadows, near the heavy drapes. Then I saw Elias Thorne. He was dressed as a waiter, balancing a silver tray of champagne flutes with practiced ease. He moved through the crowd like smoke, listening, watching. He drifted near Richard, then near the kitchen doors. He winked at me as he passed, offering a glass. I shook my head. I needed a clear head. At 8 p.m. sharp, the music died down. Richard stepped onto the raised podium at the end of the hall. He tapped a microphone. Thump, thump. The sound boomed through the speakers. He looked the part of the grieving, dutiful son-in-law. His suit was impeccable, his smile practiced. But I could see the sweat glistening on his hairline. He was a man standing on a trapdoor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard beamed, his voice projecting warmth he didn't possess. "Thank you all for coming to Blackwood to celebrate a truly momentous occasion, Thomas's 70th birthday." Applause rippled through the room. polite, perfunctory. Thomas Vance has been a pillar of this community, Richard continued, gesturing toward me with an open hand. A beacon of justice, a father, a mentor. He paused, lowering his head slightly. The acting was superb, but as many of you know, the last few years have been difficult. The accident took more than just his hearing. It took his vitality. It took his connection to the world. I stared at a balloon floating near the ceiling. I am a vegetable, I reminded myself. I am furniture. It has become increasingly difficult for Thomas to manage the complexities of this estate, Richard said, his voice dropping to a tone of somber responsibility. And it is our duty, as his family, to ensure he is protected. He signaled to the side of the room. A notary public, a short, nervous man with a briefcase, stepped forward. So tonight, surrounded by friends and witnesses, Thomas has decided to formally pass the torch, Richard announced. He is signing over the stewardship of the Vance estate to Clara and myself, so that he may retire in peace and comfort. We have the papers here, Richard smiled. We thought we would make it official, a celebration of a legacy preserved. The crowd murmured. Some nodded in approval. Others looked uneasy. They sensed the rush. They sensed the vulture picking at the bone. Richard walked down the steps of the podium. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He approached me with the clipboard. The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the amplifier and the beating of my own heart. Richard knelt beside my wheelchair. He smelled of scotch and fear. Dad, he said loudly, for the benefit of the audience. Time to sign. Remember? For your retirement. For your peace. He held out the pen. A heavy Mont Blanc, he placed the clipboard on my lap. I looked down at the document. The birthday card cover was gone. There was no pretense anymore. The header stared up at me in bold black letters. Revocable durable power of attorney. It was a death warrant for my freedom. I looked up. I looked at Clara. She was standing behind Richard near the notary. She was twisting a linen napkin in her hands, wringing it until her knuckles were white. She was looking at the floor. She was vibrating with shame. Speak, Clara, I commanded her in my mind. One last chance. Save yourself. Stop him. I waited 3 seconds. She didn't look up. She didn't move. She chose the silence. I took the pen from Richard's hand. Richard smiled. It was a greedy, triumphant smile. He thought he had won. He thought the money was already in the Caymans. I looked at the paper. I looked at the pen. Then I looked Richard dead in the eyes. I let the mask fall. I let the senile old goat vanish. The intelligence, the sharpness, the iron will of Judge Thomas Vance returned to my face in a flash. Richard saw the change. His smile faltered. His eyes widened. No, I said. The word was a stone dropped into a still pond. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, resonant. Richard blinked. What? I dropped the pen. It clattered onto the floor. Click-clack. I placed my hands on the armrests of the wheelchair. I pushed. I said, my voice boomed, finding the baritone depth that had silenced courtrooms for 3 decades. I will not sign this, Richard. I stood up. I kicked the footrests of the wheelchair away. I stood to my full height, 6'3". Even at 70, I was a towering figure. I loomed over him as he knelt on the floor. The crowd gasped. A glass shattered somewhere in the back of the room. Dad? Clara whispered, her head snapping up, her face drained of color. Richard scrambled backward, crab-walking on the floor to get away from me. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. You can speak? He stammered. You stood up? I didn't answer him. I reached out and snatched the microphone from the stand he had left behind. The feedback whined, a high-pitched shriek, then settled. I can speak, I said into the microphone. My voice filled every corner of the grand hall, bouncing off the rafters, and more importantly, Richard, I can hear. Richard's face went white. The blood drained out of him so fast he looked like a corpse. I have been able to hear for 4 days, I told the room. I scanned the crowd, making eye contact with the bankers, the lawyers, the friends. I heard you call me a senile old goat in my own library, I said, pointing a finger at Richard. I heard you tell my daughter that you gambled away her inheritance on horses and tech shorts. I heard you planning to liquidate my commercial properties to cover your debts to Marcus Sterling. The name Marcus Sterling hit the room like a bomb. People whispered frantically. They knew the name. They knew the danger. He's lying, Richard screamed, scrambling to his feet. His voice cracked, high and hysterical. He's demented. It's the dementia. He doesn't know what he's saying. I didn't stop. I turned up the volume of my voice, overriding his panic. I heard you order the sedatives from Dr. Evans. I continued, relentless. I heard you tell Clara to drug my soup tonight. I heard you planning to dump me in Sunset Haven so you could live in my house. I turned to the crowd. Is that the behavior of a son? Or is that the behavior of a thief? Richard looked around the room. He saw the faces of his peers. He saw disgust. He saw judgment. He saw his social capital evaporating in seconds. He looked at Clara. She was sobbing, her hands over her mouth. He looked at the door. He saw David Ross stepping out of the shadows, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. He was trapped. The cornered animal snapped. You set me up! Richard shrieked. Spittle flew from his mouth. You old bastard! You sat there and listened? He lunged. He grabbed a steak knife from a passing waiter's tray. The blade glinted under the chandelier. I'll kill you, he screamed. I'll kill you all. The crowd screamed. People dove for cover. Richard charged at me. Richard. No, Clara screamed. He swung the knife, a wild, desperate arc aimed at my chest. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I stood my ground like a statue of justice. Because I saw Elias Thorne. Elias moved with a speed that belied his size. He intercepted Richard 2 feet from me. He grabbed Richard's wrist. Crunch. Richard howled as the knife dropped. Elias swept Richard's legs, slamming him face first onto the hardwood floor. Thud. Stay down, Elias roared, pinning Richard's arm behind his back. Police, David Ross shouted, moving in with the officers. Nobody move! The officers. Nobody move! The officers swarmed Richard. They yanked his arms back. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut. Click, click was the sweetest sound I had heard all week. They hauled Richard to his feet. His nose was bleeding. His tuxedo was torn. He looked wild, feral. He looked at me with pure hate. Then his eyes darted to Clara. It was her, Richard yelled, struggling against the cuffs. She knew it was her idea. She wanted the money. The crowd murmured in horror. She poisoned the soup. Richard screamed as they dragged him toward the door. She crushed the pills. Arrest her too! His voice faded as they shoved him through the double doors and into the waiting squad car. The room was deathly silent. I stood on the podium. I was still holding the microphone. My hand was shaking now, the adrenaline beginning to crash. I looked at Clara. She was on her knees in the center of the room. She was sobbing, her whole body heaving. She looked small, broken. Dad, she wailed, I'm sorry, I was scared. He threatened me. I walked down the steps. The guests parted for me, giving me a wide berth. I was no longer the invalid. I was the terrifying patriarch. I stood over my daughter. I know he threatened you, Clara, I said softly. My voice was just for her now, though the microphone picked it up. She looked up. Mascara ran down her cheeks. Hope sparked in her eyes. You do? You understand? Yes, I said. I heard the phone call. I heard Marcus Sterling. Then you know? She reached for my pant leg. But I also heard you lie to me, I said. My voice hardened. I came to you in the conservatory. I asked you if you needed help. I gave you a way out. I opened the door, Clara, and you slammed it in my face. Please, Dad. You chose him, I said. You chose the lie. You are my daughter, I said, my voice breaking slightly. And I love you. I will pay for your lawyer. I will ensure you do not go to prison for the fraud. She reached for my hand. I pulled it back. But you cannot live here, I said. The sentence hung in the air. You broke the trust, I said. And without trust there is no family. You poisoned my soup, Clara. You watched him bury me. Where will I go? She whispered. You are an artist, I said. Go paint. Find your own colors. But you cannot paint over this. I turned my back on her. I scanned the edges of the room. I saw him. Leo was standing by the servants' stairs. He was wearing his oversized suit. He was clutching the banister, his eyes wide. He looked terrified. He had seen his father arrested. He had seen his mother rejected. I dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a dull thud. I walked toward him. My knees ached, but I walked tall. I knelt down in front of him, bringing myself to his eye level. "Grandpa?" he asked. His voice was a tremble. "I heard you, Leo," I said. I smiled, and for the first time in years, the smile reached my eyes. Tears spilled over my cheeks. "I heard you come into my room," I whispered. "I heard you say you missed me." Leo's face crumpled. He threw himself at me. He wrapped his skinny arms around my neck and buried his face in my shoulder. He sobbed, shaking against me. I held him tight. I held him like he was the only thing anchoring me to the earth. "I'm back, kid," I whispered into his hair. "I'm back, and I'm not going anywhere." David Ross stepped up beside us. He put a hand on my shoulder. "It's over, Judge," he said softly. I looked around the room at the stunned guests, the shattered glass, the weeping daughter, and the empty wheelchair. "Yes," I said, holding my grandson. "Court is adjourned." The aftermath was a blur of blue light. The police cruisers were parked on the gravel circle, their light bars spinning silently, washing the facade of Blackwood in a rhythmic, nauseating pulse of cobalt and shadow. The guests had fled. They didn't leave like friends. They left like witnesses at a disaster site, scuttling to their cars with heads down, whispering into cell phones, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and the ozone of the passing storm. I sat on a velvet bench in the foyer, my tuxedo jacket unbuttoned. I felt hollowed out. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation had drained away, leaving behind a leaden exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. A young officer took my statement. He spoke loudly and slowly, having been briefed on my condition, but not the update. "I can hear you, officer," I said quietly, rubbing my temples. "You don't need to shout." He blinked, flustered. "Right, sorry. Your Honor, we have Mr. Sterling in custody. The charges are extensive." "I know," I said. I wrote most of them in my head. Clara came down the stairs. She had packed a single overnight bag. She had wiped the mascara from her face, leaving her looking pale and ghost-like. She wore a trench coat belted tight, as if trying to hold herself together physically. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at me. There was no more pleading. The reality of the line I had drawn had set in. She knew me. She knew that my verdicts were final. "I spoke to the officers," she said. Her voice was brittle. "They're letting me go to the hotel downtown, pending further investigation." I nodded. "David will call you in the morning with the name of a defense attorney. He's the best in the state. Listen to him." "Thank you," she whispered. She hesitated. Her hand twitched, reaching out toward me, then dropping back to her side. The distance between the bench and the stairs was only 10 feet, but it was a chasm neither of us could cross. "I really did love you, Dad," she said. I loved him more." "I know," I said, "and that was the tragedy of it." "Goodbye, Clara." She walked out the front door. I watched through the open portal as she got into a taxi. She didn't look back. The taillights flared red, two angry eyes in the dark. And then she was gone. David Ross walked in from the porch. He held 2 heavy crystal tumblers filled with amber liquid. He sat next to me on the bench. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just handed me the glass. "Single malt," he said. "Found it in Richard's stash. Figured he owes you a drink." I took a sip. The whiskey was smooth, with a kick of peat and smoke. It burned going down, a good, clean burn that reminded me I was alive. "That was quite a verdict, Dutch," David said, leaning his elbows on his knees. "I haven't seen a courtroom stunned like that since the '98 mob trials." "It was the hardest one I ever delivered," I replied. My voice was raspy. "Sentencing a stranger is the law. Sentencing your own blood."
"That's an amputation. She'll survive," David said. "She's a Vance. Somewhere under all that fear, she has your spine." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I broke it tonight." David finished his drink and stood up. I've got an officer stationed at the gate for the night.
just in case Marcus Sterling has any friends who want to make a house call. Thank you, David. Get some sleep, Thomas. You look like hell. I feel like it. He left. The heavy oak door clicked shut. I was alone. I sat there for a long time, just listening. For 3 years, I had craved sound. I had prayed for it. Now the house was full of it. I heard the grandfather clock ticking in the hall, tock, 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 measuring out the seconds of my new life. I heard the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I heard the wind settling in the eaves. But the silence was there too. It wasn't the medical silence of deafness. It was a new silence. The silence of a house cleared of lies. The silence of a stage after the actors have left and the lights have gone down. It was lonely. It was incredibly, painfully lonely. But it was clean. I stood up. My knees popped. I walked through the darkened house. I didn't turn on the lights. I navigated by the moonlight spilling through the windows. I went to the library. I walked past the desk with the broken lock. I would have to fix that tomorrow. I walked to the sunroom. The smell of turpentine still lingered, a ghost of Clara's presence. I climbed the stairs. I stopped at the guest room door. I pushed it open gently. Leo was asleep, on the bed. He was still wearing his dress shirt, though he had kicked off his shoes. He was curled up in a ball, clutching a pillow. His breathing was steady. In and out, in and out. I walked to the bedside and looked down at him. He was the survivor. He was the innocent witness who had pulled me back from the edge. I wasn't just a judge anymore. I was a structural engineer of a different sort now. I had torn down the rotting beams. Now I had to rebuild the foundation for him. I reached out and brushed a curl of hair off his forehead. Safe, I whispered. I walked out to the balcony off the master bedroom. The rain had stopped completely. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing a tapestry of stars that looked sharp and cold. I gripped the iron railing. The metal was wet and freezing against my palms. I looked out over the estate. The trees were silhouettes against the night sky. The city lights glowed in the distance, a hum of humanity that I was finally part of again. I checked my watch. 12:01 a.m. Sunday. My birthday was over. I had planned to give Clara a surprise. Instead, I had given her a reckoning. I had planned to reclaim my life. But the cost was heavy. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, wet air. Happy birthday, Thomas, I whispered to the night. I waited. A cricket chirped in the ivy below. An owl hooted in the distance. The wind rustled the oak leaves, a sound like 1,000 pages turning at once. For the first time in 3 years, the night answered back. It didn't offer comfort. It didn't offer apologies. It offered the truth. And the truth, no matter how loud, no matter how painful, is the only thing worth listening to. Thanks for walking this journey with us all the way. With Thomas, Richard, and Clara in mind, was this ending how it should have happened, or did Clara deserve a second chance? Let us know in the comments below.